Look at me. I'm surrounded by hundreds of alien species, and I'm expected to perform like some kind of intergalactic circus animal? Tim mumbled, feeling the familiar knot of panic tighten in his stomach as he clutched his guitar, the shiny black object feeling increasingly heavy in his hands. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Not at all. He had only been playing his guitar in the park back on Earth when the ship arrived. He didn't even see it at first. The alien ship had descended quietly from the clouds, glowing with an eerie violet light. The people around him had screamed and scattered, but Tim had frozen in place, a note of uncertainty in his throat, not knowing whether he should run or just keep strumming his guitar. And that's when the alien had appeared, a tall, thin creature with an expression too alien to fully grasp, even now. The alien, humanoid in shape but with smooth, iridescent skin that shimmered in a dozen shades, stepped down from the ramp of the ship, its eyes fixed on Tim with an odd intensity. It didn't speak immediately, just observing him, its head tilting slightly as though analyzing him. Then, without warning, it made a gesture. A soft whistling noise escaped from its mouth, as though it was humming a tune. It looked like it was waiting for something, expecting something. And then, as if summoned by that strange sound, a voice, no, a presence, pierced Tim's thoughts directly. It wasn't like hearing a voice in his head, more like the feeling of being compelled to move, as though his body were already responding to a command he hadn't been given yet. Human, you will perform for the Queen. She awaits you. Tim blinked, shaking his head in disbelief. Perform for the Queen, he repeated. It felt like some kind of bad dream, but everything was so tangible, the firm grip of his guitar, the shimmering alien ship, the strange being watching him. It all felt real. Before he could respond or think of a better plan, the alien grasped his wrist and yanked him forward. The next thing he knew, he was being ushered up the ramp into the massive ship. The interior was impossibly vast, like a great hall in some ancient castle, except the walls were made of glistening metal that pulsed with a faint light. The air smelled strangely sterile, like it had been cleaned with a chemical solution, and the temperature was just slightly cooler than what Tim was used to. He wanted to ask where they were going, but the alien had already left him, disappearing into the ship's corridors with another wave of its hand. Tim was left standing there in stunned silence. Then a voice, this one in perfect English, boomed through the air. You will perform for the Queen. The Queen is most pleased with your music. She will judge your skills, and your fate shall be decided. Fate? What fate? He hadn't agreed to perform, let alone perform for some alien queen. What was going on here? Tim had no idea what he was doing, but he didn't have much time to think about it before two other figures appeared from the shadows. They were both humanoid, but far more terrifying in their appearance. Their skin was mottled with ridges, like a rock face that had been worn down by centuries of wind. Their eyes were large, with an unsettling, predatory gleam to them. Prepare yourself, human, one of them said, his voice low and rumbling, like thunder in the distance. You will perform for the Queen, and she is not a creature of patience. Do well, or you may not leave this place alive. Tim blinked again, his throat dry as dust. Was this some sort of elaborate prank? Was this some weird alien reality TV show, where they just picked people up from Earth and threw them into bizarre situations to see if they could survive? Tim couldn't make sense of it, but he couldn't deny the gravity of the situation. Okay, Tim muttered to himself, trying to calm his racing heart. He had no idea who this queen was, or why she would care about his music, but the last thing he wanted to do was offend anyone, especially an alien queen who may or may not be some sort of galactic tyrant. The hallway stretched out before him, glowing in the soft violet light, until it opened into an enormous chamber. The size of it was almost too much for Tim to comprehend. It looked like a throne room, with gleaming walls, intricate carvings of stars and unknown symbols, and a raised platform where an enormous throne rested. And sitting on that throne was a creature so grand, so incomprehensibly massive, that Tim nearly dropped his guitar in shock. The Queen, if she could even be called that, was unlike anything he had ever seen before. She was humanoid in shape but far larger, her body shimmering with a scale-like texture that caught the light in mesmerizing ways. Her eyes, enormous and almond-shaped, gleamed with an unnatural intelligence, one that made Tim feel as if she could see straight through him. Her aura, though, was what truly struck him. It was pure, undeniable power, filling the room like a force field. The very air felt heavy with it, as though gravity itself had become more intense just by her presence. Tim took an instinctive step back, realizing just how out of his depth he was. The alien queen didn't move for a long moment, only staring at him with eyes that seemed to burn into his very soul. Then she spoke, or rather, her voice entered his mind as if it was a part of him, pulling him into her presence. "Human," she said, her voice a low hum of power, "your music is known across the galaxy. You are worthy to stand before me." She gestured for him to approach. "Play for me." Tim gulped. He tried to force a grin, though it came out as a grimace. The last thing he wanted was to play in front of this creature. But what else could he do? The word fate echoed in his mind, and he knew he had no choice. He stepped forward and stood in front of her. The strange, almost oppressive silence in the room made his palms sweat, but he raised his guitar nonetheless. He strummed a chord, a little off, his fingers shaking, but it was enough. The queen's eyes flickered with something like interest. "Play for me, human," she repeated, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Tim nodded, adjusting his grip on the guitar. He needed to calm down. Focus. Play the music. He had played for audiences before, but never anything like this. The stakes were high, he didn't even know what would happen if he failed, but he had to assume the worst. With a deep breath, he began. He started with a soft melody, a simple chord progression he knew by heart. The sound was smooth, soothing, and the vibration of the guitar seemed to travel through the air, as though responding to the ship itself. He could feel the ship listening, as odd as that was. As he played, he dared a glance at the queen. Her expression remained unreadable, though Tim could see a slight ripple of something in her eyes, as though the music was stirring something inside her. It was the slightest change, but it gave him hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was doing all right. Then, as his song grew more complex, something strange happened. The room began to shift. The walls of the throne room rippled like water, and the shadows seemed to lengthen. The queen's eyes narrowed, and Tim felt a jolt of panic shoot through him. Was it his playing? Had he made a mistake? His fingers faltered for just a moment, but then he pushed forward, playing faster, more urgently. Whatever was happening, he couldn't afford to stop. His survival might depend on it. The queen's voice, a sharp telepathic command, echoed through his mind. Faster. Play faster, human. Tim's pulse quickened. He pushed himself harder, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had to perform well, there was no room for error. The queen's demand hung in the air like a dark cloud. And as the last note rang out, the room fell into a deep, unnerving silence. Tim held his breath, waiting for her reaction. Then, finally, the queen spoke. "You are acceptable," she intoned. Her voice was heavy with finality. "But the true test has yet to come." Tim's heart skipped a beat. "What?" he blurted out before he could stop himself. The queen's eyes locked onto his with a gaze so piercing, so intense, that he felt himself involuntarily taking a step back. "You have pleased me, human," she said slowly, as her enormous, galactic presence weighed down upon him. "But your fate, and the fate of your world, is far from decided." The alien queen's voice echoed through Tim's mind like a crashing wave. "The true test has yet to come." Her eyes glittered with an almost predatory gleam, as if his survival hinged on her whim. Tim's hands gripped the neck of his guitar so tightly that his fingers began to ache, but he couldn't let go. He had no choice. "What test?" Tim asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. What kind of test? What was this all about? The queen didn't respond immediately. Instead, she raised one hand, her long, glittering fingers sweeping through the air like a conductor preparing for an orchestra. A strange humming sound filled the room, and the walls seemed to shiver as if they were alive. Tim's breath hitched. The air around him felt thick, heavy with anticipation. What had he gotten himself into? Then, like a bell ringing out over a vast landscape, the Queen's voice boomed once more. "Human," she said, her words like a heavy weight in the air, "you must now face the trials. You will perform your music, but it will not be as simple as before. You will face challenges that will test your creativity, your resolve, your very spirit. You will face the trials, and your success or failure will determine your fate, and that of your world." Tim swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The weight of her words settled on his chest like a stone. His mind raced. His world? What did she mean by that? He'd barely come to terms with the fact that he'd been dragged into an intergalactic showdown, now this? Trials? He had no idea what he was facing, but one thing was clear: he needed to perform. He needed to succeed. The Queen's eyes flashed with a strange, unsettling amusement as she watched him struggle to process her words. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she extended one finger, pointing toward the far corner of the room. Tim's gaze followed her gesture, and his breath caught. In that corner stood a massive, shimmering portal, unlike anything he'd seen before. It pulsed with energy, shifting colors like liquid metal. The portal was alive, its surface rippling with what seemed like endless possibilities. He couldn't tell if it was a door or a window, or something entirely different. The Queen's voice reverberated in his mind again, this time colder, commanding. "Enter. The trials await." The creatures that had escorted Tim into the room moved aside, parting to give him space. The weight of their eyes was a constant pressure on him as he stepped forward, walking slowly toward the portal. Every step felt heavier, his heart beating in time with his uncertain strides. What did this all mean? What kind of trials were awaiting him? But the longer he stood before the portal, the more he felt like something was pulling him toward it, as if the space itself was alive, beckoning him into its depths. "I have no choice," Tim thought bitterly, the realization settling over him like cold water. If he wanted to survive this, if he wanted to get back to Earth, he would have to play. He would have to pass whatever this test was, and that meant stepping into the unknown. With one last glance at the Queen, who watched him with a cryptic, satisfied smile, Tim took a deep breath and stepped through the shimmering portal. The world around him instantly distorted. The room that had been before him disappeared, replaced by swirling patterns of light and darkness. The air felt different, strange. The ground beneath his feet shifted, no longer solid but flowing like water or molten lava. He stumbled, feeling disoriented, but managed to keep his balance. He glanced around, trying to understand where he was. The space was like a void, but not one of emptiness, rather, it felt full, as though every molecule of air was alive and connected. The colors, shapes, and lights morphed constantly, shifting like the memories of a dream. Then the voice came again, this time, not from the Queen, but from a deep, resonating hum that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the space itself. "You are in the trial of creation." Tim's throat went dry. The trial of creation? What does that even mean? The voice continued, as if answering his unspoken question. "To succeed, you must create. Your music will shape this world. It will form the path ahead. Fail, and you will be lost in the void forever." The void? Lost forever? Tim's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't signed up for this, he just wanted to go back to Earth, back to his guitar and the quiet park where he used to play. But this wasn't about what he wanted. This was about survival. The floor beneath him began to ripple like liquid, swirling in patterns of glowing blue and purple. He could feel the strange energy of the place, almost like it was urging him to do something, anything, to make sense of the chaos. Tim instinctively reached for his guitar, his fingers trembling as he pulled it close. He strummed a chord, just one, but it was enough. The sound reverberated through the air, bouncing off the shifting walls like an echo from another dimension. To his surprise, the moment the note rang out, the world around him responded. the liquid floor rippled more intensely, and the colors began to take shape, forming geometric patterns that spiraled outward like a galaxy. The walls, or whatever this space was made of, responded as well, shifting and stretching in response to the music, creating new patterns and textures. Tim's heart quickened. Could it be? His music was changing the space around him. He had heard of musical magic in fantasy novels, but this was real. It was as if the very fabric of the universe was listening to his music, bending itself in response to the notes. Encouraged by the response, Tim began to play more confidently. He let his fingers fly across the guitar strings, crafting a melody that was as bold as he could muster. The more he played, the more the world around him responded. Swirls of color began to form, creating landscapes, building structures, even creatures, strange beings that floated through the air, their forms made entirely of light and sound. The air pulsed with life as his music shaped the environment, bending it to his will. Tim couldn't believe it. He wasn't just playing music, he was creating. His guitar was the brush, and the world was his canvas. Every chord he played was like a stroke of genius, molding the space around him. But as he played, something began to change. The music, once fluid and easy, began to feel heavier. The air around him crackled with a sense of urgency, like the space itself was becoming more demanding. Tim's fingers faltered for a moment, but then he pushed forward, remembering the Queen's words, "Success or failure will determine your fate, and that of your world." The pressure was mounting. The landscape he had created began to warp, the shapes shifting unnaturally. Creatures formed from the melodies were now twisting, their movements becoming erratic, almost hostile. The once beautiful swirls of color became jagged, darkening, as if the music itself was turning against him. Tim's heart pounded in his chest as the creatures, half-formed, unstable, started to surge toward him. He had to keep playing, but the melody was falling apart, the harmony slipping through his fingers like water. "Focus," he whispered to himself, forcing his hands to steady on the strings. "This is the test. I have to create. I have to control this." But the harder he tried to play, the more the space around him resisted. It was as if the world itself was testing him, pushing back against his every note, every chord. His music no longer had the fluidity it once did. It was jagged, chaotic, and the creatures, now fully formed, were circling closer, their glowing eyes fixed on him. Tim's breath hitched as one of them lunged, its ethereal form twisting and contorting in the air. He swung his guitar instinctively, using it as a shield. The sound of his guitar crashing against the creature's glowing body rang out, creating a discordant shriek that caused the creature to recoil. But more were coming. More were circling. And the music, his music, was becoming more strained, less controlled. The pressure was unbearable. Suddenly, Tim realized something. This wasn't just about playing. It wasn't just about music. The trial wasn't merely about creating beauty or form, it was about control. It was about shaping chaos into order, transforming the swirling madness around him into something meaningful. And that realization made his heart race in a different way. This was the test. He had to master the chaos. Tim's hands shook as he gripped his guitar, the strings vibrating beneath his fingertips like they had a life of their own. The creatures that had emerged from the chaos of his music were circling around him, their glowing, amorphous bodies shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. Some were large, some small, but all had eyes that seemed to pierce through him, watching, waiting. The air hummed with tension, crackling with an oppressive energy. His mind raced, desperately trying to find a way out, a way to restore some semblance of order to the madness he had created. "Focus, Tim. Focus." The words echoed in his head, but the pressure was mounting. His fingers felt numb, and every note he played seemed to spin the world further out of control. The space around him pulsed erratically, distorting as though it could no longer bear the weight of his music. One of the creatures lunged, its glowing form rippling toward him, its elongated arms outstretched, tendrils of light flaring from its body. Tim's heart jumped into his throat, and he swung his guitar instinctively, a sharp chord ringing out. The sound shattered the air, and the creature halted, recoiling as if struck by an invisible force. The discordant noise caused a ripple through the air, and the creature staggered back, but it wasn't enough to stop the others. They were coming closer. Tim's mind raced. How do I fix this? How do I stop them? He couldn't keep playing random chords. He needed to regain control. Then it hit him, control. He was trying to control the space with his music, but he had been doing it wrong. Instead of trying to force the chaos into something ordered, he needed to let go. He needed to guide the chaos, to work with it, not against it. His thoughts started to clear, and a new clarity washed over him. He took a deep breath and let the guitar fall into his lap, cradling it gently like a child. He closed his eyes and tuned out the frantic creatures surrounding him, focusing solely on his breathing. He let go of the fear, the panic, the pressure. Create, the voice had said. Shape. He strummed a soft chord, nothing intense, just a simple hum that vibrated through the air. He allowed the sound to echo, letting it spread like ripples across a still pond. The chaos seemed to respond, hesitating for a moment, as though it were listening to him. Then, he played another note, softer this time, and another. A melody began to form, subtle at first, a whisper that carried through the void. It was calm, gentle, different from the frantic energy that had dominated before. The creatures paused. Tim's fingers moved with purpose, each note deliberate, as if painting a picture in the air. The creatures hovered, their swirling bodies becoming less erratic, their movements slowing as the music found its rhythm. He could feel the environment around him shifting, responding to his new approach. The walls of the space seemed to stabilize, their erratic shifting giving way to fluid, more harmonious patterns. The glowing tendrils of the creatures slowed, their chaotic dance becoming more graceful, more deliberate. It was working. But just as he thought he had a moment of relief, the ground beneath him trembled. A low, guttural growl reverberated from the darkness, and Tim's heart skipped a beat. He looked up in horror as something far larger and far darker than the creatures loomed in the distance, emerging from the swirling shadows of the void. It was a massive figure, its form nearly as tall as the walls themselves. Its body was jagged and spiked, radiating an aura of pure, unrelenting power. The creature's eyes were pure black, like deep voids that swallowed the light. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth, and it let out a roar so fierce that the entire space seemed to shudder. Tim froze, his guitar feeling like an insignificant toy in his hands. What was that? His breath caught in his chest. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't just a manifestation of chaos. It was the chaos, a force of destruction, of uncontrollable power. The voice from the void spoke again, its tone cold and deliberate. You have done well, human, but now the true test begins. You must face the heart of the chaos you've created. Control it, or be consumed by it. Tim's pulse hammered in his ears. He had to face it. There was no other choice. The creature lunged forward, its body stretching impossibly fast, its claws raking through the air. Tim barely had time to react. In a flash of instinct, he swung his guitar, using it as a shield. The string vibrated wildly, the sound it produced echoing like a blast of thunder. The impact of the noise collided with the creature's body, creating a shockwave that sent it staggering back. But it didn't stop, it only grew more furious, its claws slashing through the air in a fury of unrelenting force. Tim's mind raced. He needed to think. He needed to stop it, to control it, but how? He looked around him. The chaos was everywhere, swirling in unpredictable patterns, feeding the creature's strength. If he didn't stop it soon, it would overwhelm him. Then, a thought sparked in his mind. The music. The space was a reflection of his music. If he could find the right frequency, the right melody, he could direct the chaos. He could contain it. The roar of the creature deafened him, but he forced himself to focus. He closed his eyes for a moment and tuned into the sound, the vibrations that filled the air. His fingers moved across the guitar strings, slow at first, careful, searching for the right resonance. He felt the power building within the guitar, the subtle hum that ran through the instrument, the vibration in his fingertips. It was like finding a hidden frequency in the chaos. He strummed once more, softly, and the notes resonated, a perfect match for the pulse of the space around him. The walls seemed to shift with it, the colors in the air responding. And then, he played. The sound that emerged from the guitar was unlike anything he had ever produced before. It was sharp, commanding, yet fluid, a mixture of power and control. As he played, the creature faltered. The jagged edges of its body seemed to soften, its claws retracting, its massive form hesitating. The roar grew quieter, more distant, as though the music was pulling it back, reining it in. Tim didn't stop. He poured everything into the music, each note a battle, each chord a step forward. The power he felt from the guitar was intoxicating, and with every strum, he forced the creature back, into submission. The more he played, the more the creature's form unraveled, its body breaking apart like sand falling through his fingers. Finally, with one last, powerful chord, the creature dissolved completely, its body turning into a cloud of smoke that faded into the ether. The space around him fell silent, the hum of the void dissipating, leaving only the faint echo of his music in the air. Tim stood there, panting, his heart racing. Sweat dripped down his face as he stared at the space that had once been filled with chaos. Now, it was calm, almost serene. The tension in the air lifted, and he felt a deep, almost overwhelming sense of relief wash over him. He had done it. He had controlled it. But as the silence stretched on, the voice from the void spoke again, this time softer, almost approving. You have passed the trial, human. You have shown control. But know this, you have only begun to understand the depths of your power. The Queen will test you further. Tim's mind reeled. He had passed this trial, but the voice's words lingered in his thoughts, like an unsettling echo. The Queen would test him again. But for now, he had survived. For now, he had won. He exhaled, allowing himself a moment of peace, before the next trial, whatever it would be, came for him. His music had saved him, but how much longer would it be enough? Tim took a shaky breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly as the echoes of his music faded into the quiet of the space. The dark, oppressive energy that had threatened to consume him moments before now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a soft hum, a subtle reminder that he had not yet won, only survived. The trial was over, but the Queen's cryptic words lingered in his mind, the Queen will test you further. His fingers still trembled as they clutched his guitar, the familiar weight of the instrument offering a strange comfort in the midst of the unknown. The air was thick with the aftermath of his success, but it wasn't the kind of peace that left him feeling safe. It was the kind of peace that came after surviving a storm, one that left behind the faintest tremor, the sense that something else was waiting. What now? Tim thought. What else does she want from me? The space around him was still, serene in a way that unsettled him. There were no longer any shifting walls or chaotic creatures. The landscape he had shaped, with music and intention, had solidified into something far more grounded, almost tangible. He could feel the subtle pulse of the void, but it was faint, as if waiting for something to shift, to break the stillness. Tim could hardly bring himself to relax. He knew he had completed the trial. He had faced the chaos and subdued it, at least for now. But the Queen's voice in his mind reminded him of something far more ominous. You have only begun to understand the depths of your power. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The voice had spoken with a finality that made it clear this wasn't over. He couldn't shake the sense that every trial he passed only brought him closer to something bigger and darker. The Queen wasn't testing his music for entertainment. She wasn't playing games. This was serious. His survival, and the fate of Earth, were hanging by a thread. Tim had no illusions about his chances. He had succeeded so far because he had relied on his musical instincts, on the one thing that had always grounded him, the guitar. But there were still questions he couldn't answer, things he couldn't comprehend. He hadn't even seen the Queen in person yet, only felt her presence through the force of her telepathic communication. What kind of being was she, really? What power did she wield? And why did she care about him, a teenage guitarist from Earth? The silence in the void grew deeper, and for a moment, Tim thought he might lose himself in the vast emptiness. But then, as if on cue, a pulse of light flared in front of him, shimmering like a beacon. It was the portal, the same portal he had entered through, the one that had first whisked him away to the trials. Without hesitation, Tim walked toward it, the soft click of his boots the only sound in the otherwise still air. He didn't know what awaited him beyond the portal, but he knew one thing: he had to face it. The moment he stepped through, he was no longer standing in the void. The transition was so abrupt that he almost stumbled, but he caught himself. What he saw before him made his breath catch in his throat. The room was massive, more monumental than anything he had seen so far, like an ancient, alien temple, its architecture incomprehensible to his earthbound mind. Towers of glistening stone, twisting like vines, reached into an impossible height. At the center of the chamber was a throne, elevated and imposing, made from a material that shimmered with an almost living quality. It was a perfect fusion of nature and technology, organic, yet otherworldly, pulsing with a subtle energy. And sitting upon that throne was the queen. For the first time, Tim saw her in all her terrifying grandeur. She was a massive, imposing figure, larger than life. Her body was sculpted from some iridescent material, like the finest crystal fused with the smooth, unyielding surface of a gemstone. Her skin shimmered in hues of deep violet, azure, and silver, constantly shifting with each subtle movement, as though it were alive. Her eyes, those vast, ever-watchful eyes, looked down on him with an unblinking gaze that felt like it could pierce through time itself. Tim swallowed, his mouth dry. She didn't say anything at first. She simply watched him as he stood before her, feeling small and insignificant in her presence. The weight of her gaze was almost unbearable, like standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into a chasm so deep that even the thought of it made his stomach twist. Her voice, when it came, was not just a sound. It was a presence. "You have passed the trials, human," she intoned, her voice rich and deep, vibrating in his very bones. "You have shown resilience. You have proven that your music can shape reality itself." Tim's throat tightened. "What do you want from me?" The queen tilted her head, the movement so fluid, so effortless that it sent a shiver down his spine. "I do not want from you what others might. I do not desire your music for entertainment. I do not seek to own your world. No, human." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I seek something far more valuable." Tim swallowed hard. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he stood his ground. "What is that?" The queen smiled, but it was not a warm, comforting smile. It was the kind of smile a predator gives its prey just before the final strike. "I seek understanding," she said, her voice calm yet laced with power. "Your music. It is not merely a gift of your species. It is a force, a universal language, a thread that connects the very fabric of reality. It is a power that resonates across the galaxies, across all dimensions, and it is something that even I do not fully comprehend." Tim's breath caught. "What you have created," she continued, her voice rising ever so slightly, as if drawing strength from her own words. "You have shaped chaos into order. You have bent the fabric of existence to your will. But you are far from the first to possess such potential. There have been others before you, creators who shaped worlds, brought harmony to the void, or consumed everything in their path. But you, human, are different." Tim didn't know what to say. His mind was spinning with questions, none of them fully making sense. What does she mean by different? He wanted to ask, but he knew better than to interrupt her. "You are a part of a greater cycle, Tim." The queen's voice softened, just a fraction, but there was an underlying weight in her words. "I am the keeper of the ancient laws of this universe, the one who watches over the balance of creation and destruction. For too long, the forces of chaos have been growing, reaching beyond the borders of our galaxy. They threaten to unravel everything." Tim's heart pounded. "What does that have to do with me?" She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his with a piercing intensity that left him breathless. It has everything to do with you. You have the power to shape what is coming. The power to restore balance, or to destroy everything in your path. Your music, human, is not just an art, it is a weapon. A weapon unlike any the galaxy has ever known. Tim's thoughts scrambled. A weapon? He wasn't a soldier. He was a guitarist. A musician. He couldn't comprehend what she was saying. He didn't have the power she was talking about. He couldn't. You will choose, Tim, the Queen said, her voice suddenly cold, distant, and final. You will either help me restore the balance and protect your world, or you will fall to the chaos that is coming. The decision is yours. A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Tim stood there, his mind whirling, the weight of the Queen's words pressing down on him. Tim's voice faltered. I don't know what to do. The Queen did not answer immediately. Instead, she sat back in her throne, her expression unreadable. Then you must decide. Soon. The choice will come, whether you are ready or not. And with that, the room seemed to shift. The walls, the air, the light around him began to pulse once more, as though time itself was moving, shifting, preparing for something. The Queen's eyes never left him. The universe is waiting, Tim. Will you save it, or will you destroy it? And with that, the last of her words echoed in his mind as the chamber darkened. Tim's heart thundered. The future, the fate of his world, rested on his shoulders.